Okay, this is going to be chapter 2, The Germans Invade, from my dad's memoirs, From Misery to Happiness, and he published it in 2015. The Life of a Holocaust Survivor by George Freshman, and this is his liberation photo from April 29th, 1945, at age 19. I don't know if you can see that. So, chapter 1 is pretty much, home life in Poland, growing up, and the watchmaking apprenticeship, and I can read that another time. Chapter 2, The Germans Invade. I watched through the window of our front room as one of the first German tanks rolled through Grujetz, heading in the direction of Warsaw. Just as it was clearing the square, Polish artillery soldiers engaged, taking out the armored vehicle and its driver. It was September 1st, 1939. Although the Polish armed forces thwarted Germany's initial attempts, they would ultimately be unable to keep the Nazis from invading. The Reich's forces were simply too great in number and employed far more sophisticated weapons and strategies. On September 17th, the Red Army moved into eastern Poland, further hampering Polish efforts to keep the occupying forces at bay. Initially believing the Soviets had come in to fight the Germans on their behalf, the Poles put up little resistance. By the time Polish officials realized that the Soviets had invaded to secure their own interests in Poland, it was too late. Okay, by early October, Polish armed forces had faltered, no longer strong enough to fight the deluge of ground troops, aerial strikes, and U-boat attacks in the Baltic Sea. Okay, let's see how many pages this is. It's quite long. Oh, not too bad. All right. While many Polish soldiers escaped and disappeared into the local population, some were captured and sent to prison camps where they were abused, used for slave labor, or shot. Others fled into Hungary and Romania, which, while allied with Germany, had been traditionally sympathetic to Poles. Okay. Later it would be learned that in the late hours of August 23rd, 1939, just 2 weeks before the invasion of Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union had entered into a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which included a secret protocol to annex Polish lands between their two countries. Right. Okay. In the weeks and months leading up to the war, my father had spent several evenings a week at a neighbor's house listening to radio reports about the advancing Third Reich. When addressing the public, Hitler often spoke in euphemisms about the Jewish problem, quote unquote. But my father, along with most of our Jewish friends and neighbors, heard the underlying message in the Führer's words. Jews were no longer safe in Nazi-occupied territories. After the invasion, as Polish resistance quickly abated, even small towns like ours were besieged by German troops, tanks, and other heavy field artillery. In those first few days of the war, my father said little about what he knew, hoping to protect his family from unnecessary fear and worry, and aside from the presence of German troops, our lives seemed to go on as normal. My sister and I sold cookies to the soldiers, who treated us amiably, and we presumed they were good people. The mood shifted dramatically, however, with the later arrival of the SS, who wasted no time in showing us the exact nature of their intentions. The SS officers organized groups of Jewish men, my father among them, to perform forced labor, mostly road and sewage maintenance. This sparked regular beatings of Jews by the Nazis and their Polish collaborators. Whether the Poles involved were true believers in the Nazi regime or felt compelled to go along for fear of being seen as Jewish sympathizers is hard to say. In either case, the Germans were undoubtedly aware of the hostility many Poles felt toward their Jewish neighbors and seized every opportunity to take advantage of this situation. A few weeks into the occupation, my father came home from a long day of work, badly beaten and bruised. His arm was black and blue from shoulder to wrist, marking injuries from which he would never fully recover. The ruthlessness of the Nazi regime had touched our family personally, spurring a profound sense of fear and helplessness. No longer able to shield his family from the grim reality that lay before us, my father became desperate to protect his children in any way he could. Some of our Jewish friends and neighbors had been able to flee to the Soviet Union, and it was my father's hope that we too could follow suit, but we lacked the means. With my father's encouragement, my brother Abe set out for the Soviet border in mid-September. Shortly thereafter, my father arranged for my sister Rivka to marry Herschel, a young, hard-working Jewish man my father felt would be a good provider and who would protect his daughter from the German soldiers. My father approached Herschel's father, who agreed to the match. My father had also hoped to convince him to use his wagons and horses to transport both families across the Soviet border, but Herschel's father refused. Later, the Nazis would take everything from this man, and I have often wondered if he regretted dismissing my father's appeal. In any case, this surely extinguished any lingering hope of my father had of getting his entire family out of Poland, but he remained determined to do what he could. At the very least, he would marry Rivka and Herschel and send them on foot to the Soviet border. But my sister's wedding, which took place in early October, was not a happy occasion, for Rivka was not in love with Herschel. He wasn't a friend or even a neighbor. She knew him only casually through Gruyetz's Jewish community. It was a marriage of necessity, and we were all deeply saddened when she left our home for good. Not 2 weeks later, Rivka and Herschel set out on foot along the railroad line to the Soviet border. Another of my father's children now had a chance of escaping the Nazis. Later, we would get word that Rivka and Herschel did indeed make it to the neutral zone, where they joined thousands of others who hoped to escape the country. Within a day, they were allowed to cross over. Once in the Soviet Union, they would eventually reunite with my brother, who was staying in Moscow at the home of my uncle, who had escaped to Russia during the First World War. Shortly after they settled in, however, the Soviet government requested that all Jewish men become citizens so they could join the Red Army. This created anxiety for Aby and Herschel. The Polish army was well known for its anti-Semitism and related abuse. Presuming the Red Army to be no different, the three fled to Siberia, where they hid until the end of the war. After my two eldest siblings had successfully crossed over into Soviet territory, I got it into my head that I too could do the same. I missed my brother terribly and wanted to follow in his footsteps. So just as my sister and brother had done before me, I set out along the railroad toward the Soviet border, a trip that would have been too arduous for my aging parents. The journey took about a week, and I stayed in good spirits by reminding myself that I would soon see my brother and perhaps my sister and her new husband as well. When the days grew dark, I tried with some success to extract the kindness of Polish families who might be persuaded to take me in for a night or perhaps give me a bit of food. When this tactic failed, I would do my best to find a safe and warm corner to sleep in for the night. When I finally reached the border, I joined the throng of other fugitives waiting for permission to cross over. I waited for a full day and night, enjoying the relative safety of the neutral zone before the gate finally rolled open and a Jewish Russian soldier appeared on a horse and instructed us in Yiddish to move through. At once I was filled with conflicting emotions. To continue on would surely save me the misery of whatever the Nazis had in store for me. I would see my brother, perhaps even my sister, but I was also tired, hungry, and feeling hopelessly alone in a depressing crowd of crying children and helpless families carrying bundles of whatever belongings they had managed to keep for themselves. I was only 13 going on 14, still a child in many respects, and as any child feeling alone in the world would, I longed for my mother. So as the other refugees happily passed through into Soviet territory, I turned back and started the long walk home. One night during the trip back, desperate for the comfort of a roof over my head, I walked onto a farm. A woman appeared out of nowhere, startling me and batting at me with a broom as though to sweep me off the property. "Go, go, go," she hissed. "If they find you here, they'll shoot me." Weary and hungry from days of traveling, I took a chance and tried the next farm where the people were kind enough and brave enough to take in a Jewish boy for the night. When I finally walked through the door of our apartment a few days later, cold, weak, and hungry, my mother threw her arms around me, crying tears of relief. We learned later that the Soviets allowed free traffic at the border through the end of October. Between then and the end of 1939, a small number of people were allowed to pass through. After that time, the border was sealed completely. I have one more page here. By December 1939, the German occupation of Goriec was complete and our living conditions declined considerably. Our Polish neighbors had grown wary of associating with us in any way. Food was more scarce than ever. My father, who had continued on as a forced laborer, grew prematurely frail and ill. Beatings of Jews in our community had become frequent and ever more public, a warning to us all. Orthodox Jews, especially those who wore the traditional beards, payets, and religious garments, were especially at risk of being targeted. Pogroms regularly erupted in the square, during which soldiers and Poles would beat Jews bloody just for the sport. But terror struck beyond measure when the SS rounded up many of the town's most prominent Orthodox Jews, approximately 400 of our most respected and distinguished leaders, and marched them out to the cemetery where they were made to dig their own graves. One by one, they were shot and killed. It's difficult to describe the deep and cutting frustration that we, like all of our Jewish friends and neighbors, felt during that time. Fear and helplessness permeated every moment of our lives. Yet even then we still held out some measure of hope that we, being among the less religious Jews in our community, might be able to escape the worst of it. But this hope was in vain. Soon they would come for us too. Okay, that's chapter 2, Misery to Happiness, about the walk home. And it has a back to it and a picture of him and my stepmother. So thank you, and I'll continue with the other chapters soon.